Good evening, everybody. My name is Oluwatobi Alabi, but please feel free to call me Toby. I will be taking you through your research ethics class for today. So very quickly this evening, I would take us through research ethics. I'm sure we've heard on countless occasions within the academia where we make mention of research ethics. So what exactly is ethics? What are these ethics that we refer to in research, and why are they important? Why do we need to follow certain ethical standards when we conduct research? I would take us through the slides, and we would have a session during this class to engage and to interact. So I'm sure some of you might have asked yourself, I'm a very good person. Why exactly do I need to worry about research ethics? So it's not about your person. It's not about if you're good or bad. Some people even ask, what exactly can we do about a bad person that is hell-bent on doing something that is evil? While there we might not be able to do much, but it is possible to put in place processes and procedures that makes people accountable, processes and procedures that makes doing this so-called evil less desirable. So interestingly, research ethics is not just about, or even mostly about bad people doing bad things. It is about imperfect people doing imperfect things for a variety of reasons. So some of these reasons that makes good people, so-called imperfect people, imperfect humans, do things that are questionable, might include the pressure to attend. It might include socially acceptable practices that we would later discover to be not very useful. I don't like to use the word wrong or right in that context, but that would later discover to be wrong in code, but not to be very useful. It could be as a result of accidents. People do things that are imperfect for various reasons. It could be accidents. It could be a misdemeanor. It could be a wrong thing it could be a shortcut just to justify a wrong. It could be missing something, especially with new methods or technologies. One can become involved in research ethics violations through so many wrongdoings. So sometimes the right thing to do is also not very clear when we conduct research. So self-deception and other psychological tendencies are some of the other reasons that make people or researchers in this context, not to follow ethical standards. Another reason that is quite profound, that exerts a lot of pressure on researchers, include the professional pressures, the professional responsibilities. So we see a lot of a lot is expected of researchers, a lot is expected of those in the academia. So sometimes professional pressure could also make researchers unethical. This includes the demand and the responsibility to publish or perish, like some of us must have heard. The responsibility or the demand to retain tenureship, to keep a job, keeping up with peers, securing grants, being forced to a discovery. All of this encourages shortcuts and sometimes makes some researchers to embrace unethical processes and procedures in the process of their research. In the process of their research. So what are the moral foundations for research? If we want to talk about research ethics, if we want to talk about ethical standards that are important and why these standards are important in research, let us look at the moral foundations for research. So one of the moral principles, one of the moral foundations for research is the need to do good. So it's the need to do good to humans, to do good to animals, to do good to the planet, to do good to future generation. So research is the pursuit of truth, facts in this sense, looking at truth from the lens of facts and knowledge. So as researchers, we have an obligation to respect individuals. We have an obligation to respect animals, even when we're studying animals, and we have an obligation to respect the society that we are a part of and that we contribute to shaping the knowledge systems therein. So we are all co-producers in the process of knowledge creation, both the researcher and the participant. We must learn to see it as a system that services itself. So we must be sincere to that principle of doing good as a fundamental, foundational moral principle for research. The principle of research ethics stemming from the pursuit of truth. The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It's a foundational principle for research ethics. And when we talk about the truth here, what do we mean? We mean that you should be honest in your research. The whole truth in this context could mean that a failure to report certain aspects of research findings may constitute research misconduct or violate other moral standards. So the whole truth, even when we have certain aspects of our findings, certain aspects of our research that do not sit very well with the objective of the hypothesis that were put forward, you have an obligation as a researcher to be absolutely honest in the disclosure of the results of your research. And nothing but the truth could imply the practice of overstating a study's significance or adding irrelevance or misleading information can also be tagged as dishonest. And it's unethical. I say to colleagues and I say to some of my students that you do not need to sound an unjustifiable research alarm just to draw attention. So, including misleading information, overstating the significance of your study, when you know it's just to draw attention and deceit is seated at the foundation of it, it's unethical. It can also constitute an ethical research practice. So another foundational moral principle of research is we need to ask ourselves, in trying to understand why we need to hold the principle of being absolutely truthful, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing to the truth at the core of our ethical principles as researchers, is to ask ourselves, to whom do we owe this truth? And why do we owe it to them? Researchers are active participants in the process of knowledge production that occupy a significant position to influence the whole system in such a way that the outcomes of those research could be affected by the ethical stance and standards that such a researcher chooses or chooses not to abide by. And if you understand the significance of the knowledge that we produce within the academia to shaping the outcome of society, you would understand that we owe it to the society that our research findings are shaping to be honest and absolutely honest. So to whom do we owe the truth and why? To the public for their funding and for their support. Across the globe, we have a significant amount of government across the globe supporting education and funding education, supporting research and funding research. So for the funding and the support that we enjoy from the public, that we also crave to increase, and we also want to see more of such fundings and support coming through, we owe it to be honest. To individual research participants that you are a co-producer with in this process of knowledge production, or research participants, your research respondents, to those individual research participants, that you have promised autonomy and confidentiality, that you have promised to make do within your professional capacity, the narrative they've given you to suit the discussion of knowledge production in the right and appropriate way. We owe the truth to our colleagues and collaborators whose research may be based on our own research. So, like I always like to say, the academia is like a discussion panel. So when you're publishing within the academia, what you're doing is that you are contributing to the discussion. So we owe the truth to our colleagues and to our co-collaborators. A whole lot of other researchers would rely on the information that you have produced as the foundation on which they would build their own study. So if the foundation is faulty by unethical research practices, you're already laying a foundation for a knowledge system that has not gone through the rudimentary scientific process. So these are some of the reasons why research ethics must be taken very seriously. And also to other funding institutions within society that provide support. You know, we owe this truth to our research institutions, to the universities, to our employers, for those of us in the NGOs, you know, for the employment, for the resources, and because of the reputation that not standing and abiding by these research ethical principles, because of the reputation damage that it can do to you as an individual researcher. Research's obligation stems from its nature as the pursuit of truth and all knowledge. So if we are active producers of knowledge, and knowledge itself through this research that we are active part of is the pursuit of truth, we need to be absolutely honest in our dealings, in our research reporting. So now, principles of research ethics. There are core principles. We have some principles that are core when we talk about research ethics. And the first one here is respect for persons. And when we talk about respect for persons, we are talking about autonomy and protecting those with diminished autonomy. So participants in research must take part voluntarily. This is key. The participants in a research must not be coerced. Every participant of a research must voluntarily participate in that research, free from any coercion or undue influence, and their rights and dignity and autonomy should be respected and appropriately protected. So when a potential research participant, this is important. When I said diminished autonomy, and this is what it means. This is what it was referring to. When a potential research participant may lack the capacity to make autonomous decisions, they must be protected against harm. The researcher bears the responsibility of protecting every research participant against harm in the research. The second research ethics principle that we will talk about here today is beneficence and non-malfeasance. You know, so a risk-benefit assessment needs to be taken into consideration, needs to be taken into account. You need to understand the probabilities and the possibilities of both harms and benefits that can arise from a certain research. As a researcher, you need to consider what are the benefits, what are the risks that are involved in the research that you're pursuing. Risk to your participant, risk to yourself and your research team. So there needs to be a lot of consideration that goes into design, that must go into designing a research. So There are many kinds of possible harms and benefits to consider, including psychological harm, physical harm, legal harm, social harm, and economic harm. Let me give you an example, a practical example. A few years ago, I was conducting a research about the use of traditional aphrodisiac, sexual stimulants, traditional sexual stimulants among women. When I wanted to conduct that study while designing the research, I needed to ask very important questions. The specific aphrodisiac that I was looking at was kayamata. It was more popular among women in the northern part of Nigeria. But I needed to ask very important ethical questions. I am a Christian young male that potentially wanted to study something that had to do with sex that is often quite repressed among predominantly Muslim women in northern Nigeria. So that created a whole lot of ethical issues that I had to deal with and navigate. Important research decisions had to be made from the early stage of designing the study. So as a researcher, you must think through all these potential benefits and risks that your research might expose you to and might also expose your research participant and team to, and address them appropriately. Now, the third principle here is justice. This principle emphasizes the fair distribution of benefits and burdens of research. Researchers should ensure that the selection of participants is fair, avoiding any form of discrimination or exploitation. As a researcher, you must also ensure that you strive to distribute benefits of the research to all population and avoid any undue influence or coercion. It is important. The other principle that we have here is informed consent, and this is very key, because I remember that when we had our research methodology class, I also mentioned something about the informed consent. Informed consent requires a researcher to obtain voluntary and informed agreement from participants or respondents before involving them in a study. A lot of us have seen the informed consent sheet. When you pick up a survey questionnaire, it usually has the front page where the researcher introduces themselves, tells you what the research is about, the purpose of the research, the aim, the significance, and also outlines how the identity and the participant, the respondent is going to be protected. The same thing for a qualitative study. When you conduct an interview, a whole lot of institutions now require that you have the informed consent, a signed agreement between the researcher and the participant. So participants must be fully aware of the study's purpose, the procedure, the potential risks and benefits. The participant should also know that they have the freedom to ask questions, to withdraw participation or refuse to answer any specific question without facing any negative consequence. This is very important. The participant must understand that they have a right to withdraw from the study at any point without even giving you, the researcher, any reason. At any point they feel uncomfortable. So the informed consent sheet must detail all these rights and measures that are put in place to protect the participant or the respondent. Informed consent ensures that participants have the necessary information to make an autonomous decision regarding their involvement in the research. The next principle of research here, very quickly, is confidentiality and data protection. Confidentiality and data protection are essential principles that safeguard the privacy and anonymity of research participants. Researchers have a responsibility to ensure that any information collected during their study is treated with utmost confidentiality. It is crucial. It is not negotiable. Except in cases where special considerations are made and the participant gave full consent. This includes, ensuring confidentiality includes protecting participants' personal details, ensuring data is stored securely, and using anonymous identifiers, what some of you call pseudonyms. when writing the report of your study. You see, so adhering to these principles helps to build trust between the researcher and the participant or respondent. It helps to promote transparency. And it also ensures that the participant is protected from potential harm. Very quickly, the next principle is integrity. So integrity is the core principle of research ethics that emphasizes honesty, accuracy, and truthfulness in conducting and reporting your research. As a researcher, you must be transparent about your methodologies, about your data collection processes and procedures, and about any potential conflict of interest. You must conduct your research with the highest level of professionalism, adhering to ethical guidelines and standards. You see, upholding integrity not only ensures that the credibility and reliability of research as an enterprise, but also fosters trust within the scientific community and society as a whole. It is important. The last one that I mentioned there about reporting any conflict of interest takes us to the last principle I'll be discussing here on the principles of research ethics, which is conflict of interest. Conflict of interest refers to a situation where personal or financial interest may compromise the objectivity or integrity of your research. So as a researcher, you must disclose any potential conflict of interest that could influence the design, the conduct, or reporting of your research. And when we talk about full disclosure, we're talking about financial relationships, professional connections, or personal biases that may unduly influence research outcomes. Transparent disclosures in research allows for unbiased evaluation of your findings, and it helps to maintain public trust. You see, the baseline is that as researchers, we must hold ourselves accountable to these key principles of research ethics. You see, ensuring that the society that feasts on the knowledge that we produce continues to trust the process that we adopt in the production of this knowledge. We have to hold ourselves accountable at the highest level. You see, so very quickly, you see, the study was conducted between 1932 and 1972. This particular syphilis case study in the United States of America, in Alabama, I guess. It was conducted by the United States Public Health Service, USPHS. It is widely recognized as one of the most egregious examples of unethical human experimentation in history. That's why I really want you to read it. This particular case study is widely recognized as one of the most disturbing examples of an ethical experimentation on humans in the history of human civilization. This particular case study raises several significant ethical issues that continues to be a topic of debate and scrutiny even till today, since that time. So the first question, what are the ethical issues that were identified that you would identify? Some of the ones that I picked up and I love to talk about, that I always love to chat about. One of the primary ethical issues identified is the violation of informed consent. Remember, we just spoke about informed consent, the violation of informed consent. And informed consent here is referring to the part that participants must have full disclosure of what the study is about. Participants in this particular study predominantly now, listen, look at the racial undertone that makes this case study very significant, and it's still significant. Predominantly, African Americans, sharecroppers from rural Alabama, were not informed of the true nature of the experiment. They were led to believe that they were receiving free medical treatment for bad blood. Bad blood was a very common term used at that time to describe various ailments, various sicknesses. So the lack of informed consent is a clear violation of basic ethical principle. So what it implied is that participants in that study were not given the rights. They were denied the right and the opportunity to make an informed decision to choose if they wanted to be a part of the study or not to be a part of the study, because they hid information from them. Another ethical issue is that in this particular study, something happened. Treatment was withheld from participants. When you go back and you read the case study, you would understand what I mean, because it's human experimentation. They were experimenting a particular drug for the treatment of syphilis. So they had two control groups. Some people had syphilis, some didn't have syphilis. So in the 1940s, even when penicillin became known as a very effective treatment for syphilis, they didn't give it to those people. The decision was made to withhold this treatment from them, despite the fact that treating the participant could have prevented their suffering and potentially saved them. The withholding of this treatment raises questions about the researcher's duty to prioritize the well-being of the participant over the study's objective. So because of what they wanted to find out, even when the participants were languishing in pain, treatment was withheld from them. That's very unethical. So now, who should take responsibility in this case? One, there are multiple parties that I believe should take responsibility. The researchers involved, the medical doctors, the nurses need to be held accountable. The public health officials that were part of that study, they need to be held accountable. You know, they not only failed to uphold their ethical duty to protect the welfare and rights of participants, but they also actively perpetuated harm by withholding treatment from them. The United States Public Health Services that funded that study should also be held accountable. If you are funding a study, you should be able to oversee to ensure that the study abides by ethical standards, that it complies to ethical guidelines. But that didn't happen in this case. So a whole lot of participants were exposed to harm. Now, and this takes me to the very interesting part, and this would further contribute to the conversation about the importance of research ethics for research. So what are the far-reaching implications for ethical misconduct using this case study? What are the far-reaching implications for ethical misconduct using this case study? You see, so the far-reaching implication of the ethical misconduct in the Tuskegee syphilis study are profound. One, the study represents a dark chapter in the history of medical research and has had lasting effect on trust in the medical community, particularly among minority population in America ever since. So the revelation of the studies on ethical practices led to significant changes in research ethics and the establishment of guidelines to protect human subjects. So another implication is that now we can now see that informed consent is very important because it protects the autonomy of the participant and outlines the duty of the researcher in protecting the participants against harm at all times. But let me now tell you what I wanted to talk about that time, that understanding the role of a researcher within the scientific community and within the community is very significant for ensuring that we uphold research ethical standards. Because of the complexity of this case study, and because the affected participants were African Americans, it created a whole lot of trust issues within the community, especially trust issues when minority population is involved. That was why at the outbreak of AIDS, a whole lot of these minority groups refused to even take treatment or to trust the medical community because of the history of what had happened in this case specifically. So the job that we do within society is important and it's significant and it shapes so many aspects of society. That is why we must be held accountable at the highest standard. I hope that you make time to read this that case study, and we can chat further on it. This brings me to feedback time. So I want to chat to everybody again. I went through the case study, and I understand that you were busy, but do please make time to read it. It's important. It's very interesting. It would help deepen the conversation that we're having here today. So feedback. I'm throwing these questions open to the class. Now, after everything that we have said, after all that has been said and done, do you think ethical standards and guidelines are important for research? I want to hear from you now. And how do you think as researchers we can ensure that ethical standards are upheld? First two questions, let's chat. Do you think ethical standards are important, and how do you think we can uphold these standards? Feel free to unmute and speak to us. Just your first name and tell us, do you think ethical standards and guidelines are important? And as a researcher, how do you think we can ensure that these standards and guidelines are upheld at every time? Feel free to also leave your thoughts in the chat. I'm monitoring it.
Okay, good evening.
Good evening, thank you.
I am Latifa.
Okay, Latifa.
Yes. So from this end, research ethic is very, very essential. And this is because it will help the researchers to take into consideration everybody involved in the research work they are doing. I mean, the stakeholders, the humans, probably they are working towards solving problem around a particular problem. You have to take into consideration all of those people, and you have to report nothing but the truth, because there are some cases whereby some researchers will just want to write something just to have publications without checking if the thing is okay or not okay. They just want publication and nothing more. So in this case, they are not considering other factors. They are not considering the people, the all, they are not putting some things into consideration. And to ensure the ethical standards are upheld, I think before any individuals, before any researcher goes into the field, before starting anything, probably a research topic or not, they should try to know the reason why they are doing this, and also try to read the research ethical standards and go over it again before starting anything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Latifa. Thank you. That's insightful, and it's true. We must one of the basic contribution of research ethics to research is that it ensures the protection of everybody that is involved in the research process. And I think that's a key point that Latifa made. Further thoughts, contributions. Why do you think research ethics is important? How can we ensure that we uphold these ethical standards as researchers? How can we do that? Okay, as you think, I want to believe that more of you will have something to say as we go on. But this one is important. The next question, and I'll break it down with a practical example. How can ethics help us negotiate competing priorities? It looks a bit interesting the way it's been put on paper. But let me give you this example. Do you remember while teaching a few minutes ago, I gave an example of being interested in studying traditional sexual stimulants, Kayamata specifically, that was predominant, that is basically predominant among northern Muslim women in Nigeria. But I also told you that I am a young man that is Christian, that is Yoruba, does not speak Hausa. How do you think, what are the ethical issues that you think are involved in this particular example? Especially considering that most of these women, or some of them, would be married. Some of them practice, most of them practice Sharia. How would I be able to get the kind of information that I want? Is it even possible? What are the ethical issues? What are the competing priorities I have to deal with? Thinking through that example I gave. Anybody thoughts? A young Yoruba boy wants to talk about sex and sexual enhancement, and the study participants are basically married women practicing Sharia from northern Nigeria. What are the issues? As a researcher, what ethical issues does it raise immediately? Competing priorities, religion, language, exposure, education, beliefs. How does research ethics help us navigate these various spaces? Because as researchers, we need these informations. So now the question,
okay.
Yes, please, yes. Unmute and speak to us. Your name, first name, and talk to us.
Yes, this is Chime speaking. So I think in this case, in this scenario, the research ethic that we'll be looking at mostly will be like the respect for participants. So where the researcher has to respect the participants' religion, their interests, and maybe perhaps the laws guiding their tradition as well. So I think the researcher has to now be guided based on all this, the respect for each of the participants. That's what I think from my own understanding.
Thank you very much. That's useful. Respect for participants is important. It's key. Do we have any other person? You have something to say? Please feel free. We are here to learn together. It's interesting to do that together. Okay, thank you for that very insightful feedback. Maybe sharing my experience with you would open you up to begin to think very deeply about this issue, because the example I gave you did really happen. I had to conduct a study about women's use of Kayamata, but I had these ethical issues, and I've explained some of the competing priorities, various competing complex identities, So the first thing I had to deal with, how visible is it for me to go into Sokoto and think I can have private meetings with a married woman that is probably under hijab and by the culture, religious and cultural practices there. It's not supposed to speak to a man she's not married with. It is a big ethical issue, but I want the information. So the first thing I had to do was, personally, this is my personal example. It lays no standard for how anything should be done. I'm sharing my personal example. And I've reflected on these ethical issues in a paper with Forum for Qualitative Social Sciences. It's going to be out before the end of the year. And it is a scientific argument that I'm putting forward, because for me, I had to deal with these competing identities. So the first thing I had to do was to say that it's not practically visible for me now to be the principal investigator and go into Kano and think I can speak to married women, but they have the information. So the next thing is it possible? Is there any other place I think I can go to where the use of kaya matter is quite dominant, but also as a more tolerable religious practice that would allow me to access some of the participants I wanted to access? Then I thought to myself, I'm quite familiar with Ilorin. I know they also use it there. It's a big thing in Ilorin, and that's how I switched. And first, because it's a gray area. It's not a common area. How many people have written about kaya matter or sexual enhancement in relation to sexuality and empowerment from that context? So Ilorin became more of a choice location because I could navigate the space. It was also important for me to understand that I'm now returning to Ilorin as a researcher, not just as someone that once lived there. So I had to be more conscious of my positionality within this research space, another ethical issue. I had to include female research participants in my study so that my researchers, my participants are not exposed to, are more comfortable, are in no way exposed to any form of sanction, even still within Ilorin. These are ethical decisions that are made and have been chronicled. And it makes your research method chapter more interesting when you chronicle them in a way that makes meaning for your research process. And this takes me to the next question. What informal strategies do we develop to help us make ethical decisions? And I'll give you a very practical example of one that happened to me, not to waste our time this evening. While I was on the field for this same study I'm using as an example, I had recruited research participants, married and unmarried. They've been trained. They were very familiar with conducting qualitative interviews. They were also quite familiar with the cultural context in which my research field is located. So it was good. But at the earliest stage of my field work, the participants were not saying much. So while I was reviewing some of our sessions, I discovered that one of the participants mentioned that, oh, this is good, you are married. That is to one of my female research participant assistant leading the interview, said you are married, you would understand what I'm saying. Now, at that point, I discovered that marriage might be a very important form of identification for these participants that makes them settle into the research process. So I had to go back and rethink my strategy. So what I started to do at that point is I started to merge unmarried research participant with unmarried participant, married research assistant with married participant. And the trick worked. So it opened up another form of conversation about how people can draw on comfort within the field work from identifying with a particular aspect of the research or the researcher. It's also quite interesting to understand that some of the married participants said they wanted me as a male researcher to lead the interviews because it's now more interesting to see that men are interested in issues that are to affect women. So all these are ethical issues that were being made in the process of the research. And this would take me to the last question before I will come to this penultimate question. Let me go to the last question. The last question is, do we need to broaden our definition of ethics? Yes, we do. And if we can agree from my own experience that there are so many times that in the process of research, researcher has to make so many informal, to bring up so many informal strategies to navigate the research field, then we need to broaden our specific definitions of research to include that. No matter the guideline and the principles that we put in place, researchers must understand that in the process of conducting research, there might be so many other things that might come up. You might need to make so many other decisions that the current research guidelines might not even provide for. So we must see research ethics as a process that will continue to grow. We must see research ethics like the way we see laws within society. They need constant review. They need to be constantly rethought. And to the last question here, which is the penultimate question on the slide, who is or isn't in the room when we're talking about ethics? Everybody is in the room. Everybody is involved when we talk about research ethics. Everybody that deals and engages in the business of research must hold ethical research guidelines and standards very seriously. It is not negotiable. Every researcher must know this. Are we following?
Yes.
Do we have questions or thoughts from everything I just said before I close?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes, please, your first name and your question, please.
Okay, my name is Okechukwu. So my question is, in 20 last year, there was this researcher who conducted a research about banditry in Nigeria. So he claimed to have carried out this research for the past 10 years and made his publication, which drew attention from all over the country. So he was being engaged by journalists, and he was asked whether he will volunteer information that will lead to the arrest of these bandits that he had studied. Remember that he has been in the forest. I mean, he met the bandits one-on-one, and he was now being asked whether if government are to ask him to volunteer information that will lead to the arrest of these bandits, whether he's going to do that. He said yes. I want to ask whether it violates this principle of confidentiality and data protection. Yes. Yes.
And anonymity.
Yes. In research. But we have, as in vis-a-vis that his information is going to maybe guarantee national security or so.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Okechukwu. That is a very, very important question. And that is how I want us to start thinking. You see, so what it confirms is that you are really engaging the content that we have discussed today. Because this raises a very important ethical question. And like Okechukwu mentioned, it borders on confidentiality and anonymity. If I have stated in my informed consent, and I have promised my participants that have voluntarily shared their information with me, that the information that they have, the identity of the sharer will be protected, sorry, at all cost. What happens in this case of banditry when national security is involved? See, Okechukwu, what I would say to you is that it goes back to what we've been saying. The issue of research ethics is complex. You have raised a very, very important ethical issue that would raise multiple debates. You cannot say this is how it's going to be done. There are so many issues involved. Issues of national security, issues. So now the question is, if a researcher is in possession of an information that has the capacity to potentially probably lead to a genocide, are they still bounded by the oath of privacy that they have sworn to their participant? I cannot tell you a yes or no, because how do we now measure the significance in this question? How do we measure if what is at stake is worth more than the privacy of one? Because We also remember that as part of research ethics, we also owe the society absolute truth and honesty, and we are also supposed to protect the society against harm. So these are issues that we need to think about and we need to continue to engage. You understand what we've said? We need to continue to think about this. We need to continue to engage this. There are no definite answers about it. Okay. I hope that satisfies your curiosity to some extent.
Definitely, sir.
All right, thank you very much. Do we have another question before we wrap up? Any other question? Any thoughts, please? Feel free. Questions. Okay. Please also note that my email is available. It's on the first slide. If you think through things from my first lecture with the class, I had some of you sending me emails, and it's very interesting to also converse and chat to you via email. Feel free to drop an email. I would reply as soon as I can. So in conclusion, the fact that you think about research ethics does not make you a good person. However, a study of research ethics can provide you with a map of ethical issues so that you would be able to recognize them when you come face to face with them in the research field. Although this exposure and guidelines, as the case may be, would not solve all your problems. And that's the point I was trying to make when I was using myself as an example and while answering Ukechukwu's question. It is very beneficial to have early warnings of where the dangers are located in every research. That's why from the formulation of a research, you need to begin to think about the ethical issues that are inherent. You will also be able to recognize, being conscious of the ethical issues would also make you recognize when you or someone you know are entering or in the middle of an ethically challenging situation, so you can avoid it or address it immediately. So the bottom line is that it is important to consider ethical aspects of your research. Very important. And you must also understand that in some situations, it gets very tricky, that the guidelines might not even be sufficient to deal with the issue at hand. So learning about research ethics cannot motivate you to want to do the right thing, but it would give you more tools with which to think about how to do the right thing in difficult situations in the future and as you navigate the research field. I want to believe that tonight's lecture has opened you up to the significance of ethical standards and guidelines in research, and that going further, you begin to engage and you stay conscious of these as you progress on your research journeys. Thank you very much, guys. It's been a very great evening with you.